I never forget this. I was not able to do anything. This is my story, Charlotte. Westbrook stood at the center of the grand cathedral, surrounded by white roses, crystal chandeliers, and the whispers of 300 elite guests, all dressed in luxury. She looked calm, composed, almost serene, but inside her heart was racing, not from love, but from precision. Today was not just her wedding day, it was her courtroom, her stage, her battlefield. Every detail had been planned down to the second, from the diamond veil resting on her shoulders to the soft music echoing through the hall. Everyone believed this was the fairy tale wedding of a billionaire tech heir and his elegant bride. They believed she was lucky, chosen, blessed. What they did not know was that Charlotte already knew everything she knew about the affair, the hidden apartments, the secret payments. The late-night meeting, she knew the woman sitting confidently in the third row wearing a red designer dress, pretending to be a family friend. She knew the cruel laughter of her future in-laws when they spoke about her behind closed doors, calling her naive, calling her replaceable, calling her a pretty face with no power. They had no idea who she really was or what she had prepared. The groom, Ethan Blackwell, stood across from her, smiling confidently. A man admired, feared, envied. His empire spanned finance, real estate, biotech. His name alone opened doors and silenced questions. He believed this wedding was his victory, a final step to securing a public image of loyalty, stability, and respectability. He did not know that Charlotte had spent months collecting evidence, wiring accounts, documenting fraud, tracking shell companies, and cooperating quietly with federal investigators, while pretending to be the perfect, obedient bride. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the room remained silent, just as expected. Charlotte smiled softly, then raised her hand. The room froze. Gasps rippled through the guests. Ethan turned, confused, whispering her name, thinking it was a joke, but Charlotte stepped forward and calmly asked for the microphone. The priest hesitated. The guests leaned in, phones subtly lifted, security shifted uneasily. Charlotte took the microphone, her voice steady, warm, almost loving. She thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about love, trust, and truth. Then she looked directly at Ethan and asked him to look at the screen behind them. As the lights dimmed, the massive display flickered to life. And in that moment, the fairy tale shattered forever. The screen behind the altar filled with images that no wedding guest ever expected to see: private messages, hotel receipts, surveillance photos, and bank transfer logs scrolling slowly as if time itself wanted everyone to absorb the truth. Ethan staggered back a step, his smile collapsing. His mother clutched her pearls. His father stood rigid, fury and fear battling on his face. The woman in the red dress tried to stand, but security discreetly blocked her path. Charlotte continued speaking, her voice calm, almost gentle, as she narrated what the images showed: years of betrayal, dates, timestamps, locations, how Ethan had maintained a relationship with his mistress while promising loyalty, how company funds had been rerouted to luxury condos, gifts, and offshore accounts. The guests whispered, some gasped, others stared in stunned silence. This was not gossip. This was evidence. Charlotte explained how she had discovered everything, not through suspicion, but through numbers. She had always been good with numbers, better than anyone knew. She spoke of noticing inconsistencies, unusual transfers, patterns that did not align with corporate reporting. She described late nights pretending to sleep while recording calls, emails, auto-forwarded financial ledgers quietly downloaded. Ethan tried to interrupt, his voice cracking, but the microphone was already muted. The priest backed away, unsure whether this was a wedding or an execution. Charlotte then turned toward her future in-laws, addressing them directly. She repeated the insults they had whispered about her, mocking her background, her intelligence, her worth. She described the dinners where they laughed, thinking she did not understand their coded language. She revealed that she spoke their native tongue fluently, that she had recorded those conversations. To the room erupted into chaos, but Charlotte raised her hand and silence returned. She was not finished. She revealed that the affair was only the beginning, that the real crime was fraud, massive, calculated, and ongoing. She explained how shell corporations were used to launder money, how charities were exploited, how international regulations were bypassed. She spoke as if delivering a lecture, not revenge. And then, as if summoned by her words, the cathedral doors opened. Heavy boots echoed across marble floors. Federal agents entered, badges visible, weapons secured. Calm, professional, unstoppable gasps turned into screams. The agents moved with purpose, approaching Ethan and his parents, reading rights as the guests watched history unfold live. Charlotte stepped back, removed her veil, and placed it gently on the altar. Her role as bride finished her role as architect of justice complete. As the agents closed in, Charlotte felt the weight she had carried for months finally lift from her chest. The cathedral, once filled with celebration, now hummed with disbelief and fear. The guests stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or witness the end. Ethan shouted that it was a misunderstanding, that this was a setup, his voice echoing desperate and hollow. But no one listened. The agents guided him forward, cuffs clicking softly yet loudly enough to shatter his authority. His mother collapsed into a chair, whispering prayers. His father attempted to argue, citing lawyers. Influence, donations, power, but the agents were unmoved. Charlotte watched calmly, remembering every moment. They had dismissed her intelligence every time they smiled condescendingly at her silence. She remembered the nights she cried quietly, then wiped her tears and continued building her case. She remembered the mistress texting smug messages, thinking she had won, thinking she was untouchable. Now that woman trembled, surrounded by security, her confidence draining as agents questioned her as well. Charlotte addressed the guests once more, thanking them for bearing witness. She explained that this was never about humiliation. It was about truth, accountability, and survival. She spoke of how many lives were affected by corporate greed, how employees' pensions were drained, how investors were deceived, how charities lost funding. She revealed she had been working closely with federal prosecutors for months, ensuring every document was verified, every accusation supported. The guests realized then this was not an emotional outburst, but a carefully executed operation. Charlotte then revealed another truth that stunned the room even further. She was not dependent on Ethan. She never had been. Years before meeting him, she had quietly built her own empire under a different name, investing, acquiring, innovating, while keeping her identity hidden. She had wanted love, not power, but when love became deception, she chose justice over fantasy. Murmurs spread as guests searched their memories, connecting dots, recognizing companies' deals, headlines. Charlotte Westbrook was not a victim. She was a strategist, an architect, a force. She concluded by announcing that the wedding funds had already been redirected toward restitution programs, legal funds, and employee recovery initiatives. Every dollar accounted for, every lie answered with truth. As she stepped away from the altar, the bells outside began to ring, not in celebration, but in closure. The end of one illusion and the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond those cathedral walls. Outside the cathedral, the sound of sirens blended with the distant ringing of bells as reporters began gathering, sensing that something historic had just occurred inside. Charlotte walked slowly down the aisle, no longer a bride, no longer pretending. Her heels echoed against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each breath steady. Guests parted instinctively, some in awe, some in fear, some in shame. As they realized they had witnessed the collapse of a dynasty built on lies, Ethan was led past her, his eyes searching her face for mercy, for confusion, for any sign. This was a nightmare, but Charlotte met his gaze with quiet finality. There was no hatred, there only certainty, the kind that cannot be negotiated. The mistress was escorted out. Moments later, her red dress now wrinkled, her makeup streaked her earlier arrogance. Reduced to panic, she tried to speak to Charlotte, to explain, to blame, to beg, but Charlotte did not turn back. The doors closed behind them, sealing the past inside. As Charlotte stepped into the sunlight, flashbulbs exploded, voices shouted questions, accusations, praise, disbelief, but she raised her hand and silence followed. She spoke briefly, stating that justice was not revenge and truth did not require permission. She declined further comment and entered a waiting car as it pulled away. Memories flooded her mind the first day she met Ethan, the charm, the promises, the subtle control, the way he underestimated her curiosity, her intelligence, her patience. She remembered how she had once imagined a future built on partnership. How she had believed love could soften ambition, but betrayal had sharpened her. Instead, the car moved through city streets. While inside federal buildings, documents were already being filed, assets, frozen warrants, expanded. Charlotte knew this was only the beginning. Investigations would widen, board members would fall, politicians would distance themselves, donations would be questioned, alliances would fracture. She had prepared. For that, 2 offshore accounts traced whistleblowers, protected evidence mirrored in multiple jurisdictions. She had learned long ago that power fears transparency more than exposure. She reached her apartment, changed into simple clothes, and sat alone for the first time in months, allowing herself a moment of stillness. Then she opened her laptop, not to celebrate, but to continue work. She had companies to stabilize, employees to protect, statements to release. This was not the end of her story. It was the moment she reclaimed authorship of it. As night fell, the city buzzed with breaking news headlines and whispered conversations. Screens across the world replayed clips from the cathedral, speculating, debating, arguing over every frame. Charlotte sat in her apartment, lights dimmed, watching silently as analysts struggled to understand how a bride had dismantled a billionaire empire in a single morning. Commentators argued whether it was betrayal or brilliance, while social media erupted with admiration, shock, and outrage. Hashtags formed overnight, painting her as both villain and hero. Charlotte ignored it all. She focused instead on the messages coming in from employees thanking her for saving pensions from collapse, from investigators confirming new arrests, from legal teams reporting that key witnesses were coming forward. Emboldened by the public exposure, she reflected on the months leading up to this moment, the careful observation, the quiet questions, the fake smiles at family dinners, the patience required to let arrogance reveal itself. She remembered the moment. She confirmed her suspicions when she saw a transfer routed through a charity shell that should not exist. From that moment, emotion became irrelevant, only structure remained. She had designed her plan like an engineer, building redundancy into every system, ensuring no single failure could undo the whole. Ethan had believed love made her weak. He had believed silence meant ignorance. He had believed power made him immune. Those beliefs were his undoing. Charlotte drafted a public statement. Not defensive, not emotional, simply factual. She outlined her cooperation with authorities, reaffirmed her commitment to ethical business, and announced a new foundation dedicated to corporate transparency and whistleblower protection. She knew critics would call it image management, but she did not care. Results mattered more than narratives. Late that night, her phone buzzed with one message she had been expecting. From her doctor, confirming what she already knew: she was pregnant. She placed a hand over her stomach, emotions finally surfacing, not fear, not regret, but resolve. This child would not inherit lies or shadows. This child would know that dignity was non-negotiable and truth was worth any cost. Charlotte closed her eyes for the first time that day, not as a bride, not as an avenger, but as a woman who had chosen herself and rewritten her future. Morning arrived with an eerie calm, as if the world needed a pause after the shockwave. Charlotte awoke early, brewed coffee, and reviewed overnight reports confirming what she anticipated: accounts, frozen subsidiaries, raided executives, detained. The empire that once seemed untouchable now unraveling. Thread by thread, she moved through her apartment with quiet efficiency, preparing for meetings already scheduled, with trustees, auditors, and legal counsel all briefed months ago under non-disclosure agreements. They knew her not as a bride, but as a principal, a decision maker, a leader. When the video call began, faces filled the screen, some anxious, some relieved. She spoke clearly, assigning priorities: employee protections first, payroll continuity second, compliance cooperation absolute. She refused to let thousands suffer for the crimes of a few. She instructed teams to separate viable operations from contaminated ones to preserve innovation. Without preserving corruption outside her building, protesters gathered some in support, some in condemnation, holding signs that simplified a complex truth into slogans. She did not look down. She had learned long ago that public opinion is a tide, not an anchor. By midday, prosecutors requested further testimony. Charlotte agreed without hesitation, providing timelines, context, and strategic insight into how Ethan had manipulated structures to avoid detection. Her cooperation accelerated indictments, expanding the scope to include lobbyists, bankers, and consultants who had enabled the scheme. The news cycle struggled to keep up. Analysts coined phrases like wedding takedown and cathedral collapse, but Charlotte rejected sensationalism. Privately, she drafted memos focusing on policy gaps and systemic failures, because accountability without reform was only theater. That evening, she visited her mother, a woman who had taught her resilience without bitterness. They sat together in silence, then spoke softly about the child, about safety, about boundaries. Charlotte promised to protect this new life fiercely, not with secrecy, but with integrity. She knew the road ahead would be hard litigation, public scrutiny, attempts at character assassination, but she also knew she had prepared for storms long before clouds appeared. As she left her mother's home, she felt a steady certainty settle within her. Justice had a cost, but so did silence, and she would never confuse the two again. Days turned into weeks, and the aftermath continued to expand like ripples across a still lake. Charlotte remained composed as court dates were scheduled and sealed indictments became public knowledge. Former allies of Ethan rushed to issue statements, denying involvement while quietly hiring defense attorneys. The business world shifted alliances, overnight distancing itself from the Blackwell name that once commanded instant respect. Charlotte watched it all from a measured distance, understanding that power never disappears, it only changes hands, and she intended to ensure it would be held responsibly. She attended closed-door hearings, providing testimony that was precise, unemotional, and devastating in its clarity. Judges listened. Prosecutors, not a defense attorneys, avoided her gaze. Every document she presented aligned. Every timeline matched. She was not speculating, she was proving outside the courtroom. The mistress attempted to negotiate a media interview, offering tears and partial truths, but the networks declined once investigators confirmed her role as an active participant, not a victim of deception. Charlotte felt no satisfaction in that outcome, only a quiet confirmation that accountability does not discriminate between titles or tiers. As the legal machinery moved forward, Charlotte began restructuring her public identity, revealing for the first time the companies she had built under pseudonyms years earlier. Markets reacted with shock and respect. Analysts revised profiles, calling her one of the most underestimated architects in modern finance. She announced leadership changes, promoting internal talent, prioritizing ethics audits, and transparent reporting frameworks. Critics attempted to paint her actions as calculated branding, but whistleblowers continued coming forward, validating her claims and strengthening reform initiatives behind the scenes. Threats arrived, anonymous messages, legal intimidation attempts, subtle warnings masked as advice. Charlotte documented everything, forwarding it to authorities, refusing to be silenced by fear. She had learned that intimidation thrives on isolation, and she refused to be isolated. She spoke at a closed summit, addressing regulators not as a victim, but as a collaborator, proposing systems that reduce dependency on trust and increased reliance on verification. When she left the venue, seasoned officials admitted privately that her insights would reshape oversight policies. That night alone in her apartment, Charlotte allowed herself one small moment of reflection. She stood by the window, feeling the weight of the future and the life growing within her. She whispered a promise not to repeat cycles of silence, not to trade truth for comfort. The world might remember the wedding, but she knew this was the real transformation, the quiet rebuilding of systems, lives, and self on foundations that could not be easily corrupted. The trial dominated headlines as proceedings began drawing international attention. Courtroom seats filled with journalists, legal scholars, and former allies eager to witness the downfall of a man once considered untouchable. Charlotte entered each day with calm resolve. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. She was not there to perform, but to testify. And when she took the stand, the room leaned forward. Her words were measured, methodical, each sentence. Dismantling years of deception, she explained financial structures in language that left no room for confusion, revealing how complexity had been weaponized to obscure theft, how trust had been exploited as a shield. Ethan avoided her gaze throughout his confidence, replaced by hollow defiance. His defense attempted to frame her as vengeful, but cross-examination exposed that narrative as fiction. Emails, timestamps, contracts, and witness corroboration aligned too perfectly to dismiss. Jurors listened attentively, recognizing truth when it appeared without theatrics. Outside supporters gathered, holding signs, praising courage and integrity, while critics questioned motives, unable to accept that a woman could act without emotion driving her decisions. Charlotte ignored both, focusing on facts, not applause. During a recess, prosecutors informed her that additional charges had been approved, including international money laundering and obstruction. Expanding the case beyond expectations, she nodded, unsurprised, knowing corruption rarely exists in isolation. That evening, she met privately with employee representatives, reassuring them of protections, outlining recovery plans, and inviting oversight because trust rebuilt in secrecy was fragile. She announced scholarship programs for those displaced and committed to long-term community reinvestment, not as charity but as responsibility. Late at night, Charlotte reviewed nursery plans, choosing simplicity over extravagance. She smiled softly, realizing this future would not be built on illusion or inherited power, but on values she could defend without compromise. As the trial progressed, verdicts became inevitable, but Charlotte understood something deeper. Justice was not a moment. It was a process requiring endurance, patience, and clarity, and she was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. The verdict came on a quiet morning, heavy with anticipation. The courtroom filled before sunrise, and when the jury returned, the air felt charged, as if history itself held its breath. Guilty counts echoed one after another: fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction. Each word landing like a final nail, sealing the collapse of a legacy. Ethan's shoulders slumped. His parents wept silently. The mistress stared, head expressionless, as if already resigned to a future rewritten. By consequence, Charlotte listened without visible reaction, not because she felt nothing, but because she had already processed this ending long before the world caught up. Sentencing dates were scheduled, assets permanently seized, restitution ordered, amounts that would take decades to calculate and years to distribute. Outside, the courthouse cameras flashed again, but Charlotte declined statements, choosing action over commentary. In the weeks that followed, she focused on transition, overseeing leadership shifts, ensuring operations stabilized and workers protected. She launched transparency platforms, making financial data publicly accessible, inviting scrutiny instead of fearing it. Regulators consulted her as reforms advanced, citing her case as precedent. Universities invited her to speak, not about revenge, but about ethics, systems, and courage. She accepted, selectively emphasizing that accountability should not rely on extraordinary circumstances, but on ordinary safeguards. As her pregnancy progressed, she slowed her pace slightly, delegating more, trusting the teams she had built carefully. The media fascination eventually faded, replaced by new scandals, new distractions, but for those directly impacted, her actions remained transformative. One evening, Charlotte returned to the now empty cathedral, walking quietly through the space where illusion once thrived. She did not feel anger, only closure. She placed a single white rose on a bench and left without looking back, understanding that some chapters deserve no epilogue. That night, she prepared for motherhood with the same intention she had applied to justice. Grounded, present, and unafraid, she knew her child would one day ask about their beginning, and when that Time came she would tell the truth, not as a tale of betrayal, but as a lesson in choosing integrity when silence seems easier. Years later, the world remembered the wedding as a spectacle, a headline, a moment frozen in viral clips. But Charlotte remembered it as the day she chose alignment over illusion. Her life settled into a rhythm. Defined not by excess but by intention, she became a mother welcoming her child into a quiet room. Filled with light, not cameras, she held that small life and felt a depth of purpose no courtroom victory could ever equal, raising her child with honesty, teaching curiosity, courage, and the strength to question power rather than worship it. The companies she rebuilt became models of governance, studied not because of scandal but because of resilience. Employees thrived, innovation returned, communities recovered the foundation she created, grew internationally, protecting whistleblowers, funding investigative journalism, and supporting ethical leadership programs. Ethan faded into obscurity, his name referenced only in textbooks and case studies, a cautionary example rather than a symbol of success. Charlotte never spoke ill of him publicly. She understood that ego seeks attention even in downfall. Instead, she invested her energy into creating systems where no single individual could cause such harm again. As her child grew older, asking questions about fairness and truth, Charlotte answered, simply explaining that love without respect is not love, and power without accountability is danger. One evening, while watching the sunset, Charlotte reflected on the path she had walked. She felt no regret for the wedding that never was, because it had given birth to a life defined by authenticity. The guests had been stunned that day by what the billionaire groom said, but history would remember something greater. What the bride did, she had stood in the center of spectacle and chosen substance in the face of betrayal. She chose clarity in the presence of power. She chose truth, and in doing so, she did not just expose others, she revealed herself. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a woman who understood that real justice is quiet, lasting, and free. And with that knowledge, she stepped fully into the life she had claimed, one deliberate choice at a time.